But specifically, I'm on a mission to democratize leadership. It's too much thought of as a title or a role or a set of responsibilities or something on somebody's degree. And leadership is none of those things, right? Leadership is a verb. The difference in leaders is people get better on their watch.
Over the course of my life and career, I've discovered the power of consciously investing in mindset and personal development. It has been a true game changer for me in my personal and professional life, and I'm extremely excited that you decided to join us today to take one step forward in your own life. Most of my breakthroughs have come from one-on-one conversations. We created this show to bring you those unfiltered conversations each and every week.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Connected Mindset Live. I'm your host, Greg Tomczyk. Thanks so much for joining in, whether you're watching this live on Friday, the 19th of January, or tuning in on YouTube. We're thankful to have you here for another insightful discussion with Wally Schmader. Many of you guys may know him in the 757 community, but you're going to get to know him at a deeper level here today. I'm looking forward to diving in with Wally. And thanks so much for joining us, Wally.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Good to see you, Greg.
Good to see you as well. Wally, so where we like to start the show, as opposed to giving a full background because you have an exceptional one, is to understand Wally at a kind of mission level. So I think it'd be a great place to start by filling us in on what mission you're on and then what you're hoping with that mission each person listening in today walks away with.
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah, mine is really easy. So I'm all about leadership, as you know. Every conversation we've ever had, Greg, has been about leadership. But specifically, I'm on a mission to democratize leadership. It's too much thought of as a title or a role or a set of responsibilities or something on somebody's degree. And leadership is none of those things, right? Leadership is a verb. It's something you do. It's a set of activities, priorities, decisions. And in democratizing the idea of leadership, it means anybody can be a leader, right? Which is the truth. And so I spend all day, every day, trying to turn managers, supervisors, individual producers into leaders and letting them know that they can have that kind of influence and send those kinds of ripples out into the world, as you well know. So that's my mission for sure.
Excellent. I love it. For those folks that are still trying to contextualize the word and the action of leadership, how do you describe leadership to someone who may not have seen it before or has been in a position to actually exercise the muscle of leadership?
It's a good question. I'm in that conversation a lot. So let's define it. So we know leadership is not a title. We know it's not a role. We know it's not a degree. It may or may not be even in your job responsibilities. We know it is, if you're a leader or have leadership responsibilities over other people, the difference in leaders is people get better on their watch, right? If someone is getting better because they work with Greg, they're working with a leader, right? That's actually a difference between leadership and management, right? For a manager, you show up, you do your job, you go home, right? If you're working for a leader, you're getting better over time. And that's why it is so democratic, because I can be a peer of yours, not your boss at all, and still positively influence your work, positively influence the value that you can contribute to our organization, whatever it is. And so, and it's complicated because I think that there's a number of people your age and younger that are a little bit cynical, and even the word doesn't mean what it used to. And that's probably, I believe it's because, and here, these are opinions, not facts, that in some ways our political leadership has let us down, right? We've seen a lot of partisan stuff in the last 20 years, a lot of bickering, right? And so even the word, I think, has lost a little bit of its shine, unfortunately, because we haven't seen high profile leaders. Like even 40 or 50 years ago, high profile business leaders had a different set of priorities, and the things that you saw them doing were not what you see people doing now, right? We think about our billionaires and all these celebrity CEOs who are adding nothing, right? They're doing all these things that they want to do around vanity and accumulation. So I think in some ways, younger people especially are looking at leadership as an idea with a little bit of a little cynicism. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a number of parallels that are coming into play with social media, with TV and portraying a leader, and what that is. Most of the time, the people that you see that are representing leadership are very loud, and they may be obnoxious or posting things that are calling people out.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost confusing people on what an actual leader should do and act
Yeah.
which is confusing.
Oh, well said. And they're definitely in the me business, right? The high
Yeah.
profile leaders, I could say all the names, you know them, but the
Mhm.
famous business leaders today are definitely in the me business, with the exception maybe of Bill Gates, who obviously is doing a lot
Yeah.
of good in the world. But it used to be that was kind of a mandate. You get to a certain level as a leader, and you're definitely in the business of elevating your community, right? And we see
Yeah.
that, Norfolk's a great example, and we have a lot of amazing leaders that consider that part of their job. So we're lucky and a little bit spoiled, probably. But no, I'm with you that what we get to see, and I think about it through like my kids' age, like they're 30 and 33, and what they've seen, like they're totally cynical about
Mhm.
leadership, big business leadership. What have they seen, right? So all they're doing is reacting to the channels that they're plugged into. To your point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a confusing time for leadership, and I think you're at an ideal intersection, to help be a leader for other leaders, which I want to dive into. But one of the things I'm curious about when it comes to leadership, I know the folks listening in are probably curious about as well. And I know leadership comes in all shapes and sizes. I think back to a article I had in the Virginia Pilot, like in high school, and I was, the captain of the baseball team. And the writer after our interview put out, Tom Chick leads by example, but has few words to say. For the younger, because I was a relatively shy kid and I didn't say much, but I tried to let my actions speak for the skills I had on the field, the things I did in the classroom, and things of that nature. And I had some people in my community kind of almost demonize that, like, you need to talk more. I had some people say, my son or my daughter was in one of your classes, and they really learned a lot just by watching your action. So when I thought about leadership, it was hard for me to say this is what a leader looks like, because they're all created a little bit differently, different shapes. But do you see a difference between those kind of rah type leaders and then leaders that lead? And is there a balance you try to find with folks when it comes to that, or do you leverage those strengths?
Yeah, I thought what you're talking about in our business in leadership
Mhm.
training and consulting, we call it leadership presence, right? So leadership presence shows up in so many different ways, and some of the most impactful. I'm sure you've had coaches like this, but impactful,
Mhm.
influential leaders aren't very vocal, right? And they do lead by example, or even more powerfully, they lead with their expectations, right? Like you can have someone who doesn't say much that has incredibly high expectations, who'll make you do stuff. I'm sure you've had these coaches and
Yeah.
leaders in your life. They'll make you do things you never would have done for yourself. Like you will outperform what your own expectations would have been because of the expectations of a leader. And expectations don't make any noise, right? But they show up on the field, they show up in the boardroom, they show up out in the marketplace. Then flipping it over the other way, those very vocal leaders are also playing to their strengths. Like there's some people who just have a gift for being motivating with words, and not all those people are good examples, right? So they're playing to their strengths. So I think that there's a lot of room, and it's interesting. You have a certain kind of leader, and they've got a certain number of, let's say, followers or teammates. It's not going to land the same on everybody. Have you ever noticed that? Like sometimes the very motivational leader who's outspoken is off-putting for a certain kind of person. I never liked that kind of. I did not want to be motivated. To this day, please don't motivate me. I don't need that. I'd love to be led. I'd love to be
Yeah.
taught. Right?
Yeah.
Don't motivate me. Yeah. How about you? How'd you react to? Were you better with the high expectations kind of leader or the highly vocal leader?
Yeah, definitely the expectations. I think I had one coach that was heavily vocal that I really resonated with, but it was because he was very vocal about like your primary aim, and he was very vocal about, where we're headed or the strategy of the other team. So he was teaching through the vocal and the words that he used, as opposed to kind of almost artificially trying to get us hyped up for the game, no matter who the opponent was.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those people where I thrive in more of a learning environment where I feel like I'm growing. I feel like I'm being asked hard questions. And I think those are the best coaches that I had, even at the highest levels, were the ones that knew when to say something and knew when not to say something. And that's a huge, I think,
Well, that's
sense for a leader.
yes. Yeah. And you're talking about a leader with a big skill set there, right? So the best leaders, the very best leaders, and we know some of these people in common can do it all, right? They can lead with their expectations. When it's time to be vocal, they're ready for that. When it's time to be quiet, they got that. When it's time to just influence with critique or with recognition or something, like, they have all those tools. And that's basically my work, is trying to fill up that toolbox for leaders, because usually you'll have something that comes naturally, which is great. But if you stop there, there's going to be a certain percentage of people that you're not going to be able to influence, right? Like, if all we both worked with people, all they know is sort of the threatening kind of leadership, or the very, very vocal leadership. And sure, they'll motivate 40% of the team, but what about the others, right? You got to have other tools.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, just with my military background and, obviously being surrounded by a lot of military leaders in our area. That's, my parents grew up in that environment with their parents in the military, and you start to, at some point in life, and I think we all kind of get to this point, or it happens continuously, where we ask kind of, how did we get here? And, what were the things in our upbringing that got us here and can be leveraged? And then what are some things, you may need to get rid of, or, put in the past? And I thought a lot about that from the leadership standpoint. Like, do I, as a leader, kind of act like a military leader, which is that, like, quiet, and then you could snap, at any point in time, and then people are like, whoa, why'd he do that?
Yeah.
And it shocks them, as opposed to establishing the baseline up front, which is what I try to do today, is, really level set those expectations up front, so people know how to either exceed or meet that goal. And if you don't express them, people don't know where they stand, and that doesn't create certainty for them. So.
Now, I can tell you've given that some thought. That there's a whole skill set that most people with military experience come out with, especially if they've been leaders in the military, and it's an amazing skill set. And I could tell you what totally, just having worked with a lot of these people, what definitely works, and you know all these things too that you brought into your civilian leadership world, and a couple of things that don't. Like, people can't quit. Not everybody reacts to duty, right? Not everybody respects the chain of command, right? So you get out into this, whatever we call this world, and it's like, hold it, what's going on? This didn't work like this in the other place. I work with a company called Recruit Military, and Tim Best, who you've met, and their whole mission is to help people translate their military leadership skill set into the sort of commercial, right, civilian military. And it's they got big muscles, right, in certain areas, and others that need some developing. But they always do, right? Because these people also have a sense of what leadership is. You can't spend any time in the military without understanding the impact of leadership, right? So you come out with appreciation, which is great.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting business, because he is almost, I'm sure he was at one point in that position of transitioning. And it's like the light bulb goes off of, I need to teach people this formula, or this toolbox that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, for sure. He was a helicopter pilot. People did what he said without question. Like, no one's questioning that guy, like, which is not how it works out here. I'm sure you've noticed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But
man, that's incredible. So do you think that, and I want to dive into more about the tools that you think are essential for the toolbox. Do you think those expectations are step one whenever you want to start being a leader, or be put into a leadership position by somebody else? Do you think they have to recognize your expectations in order to, I guess, respect you as a leader, or acknowledge you as somebody who can help them improve?
Yeah, I think so. That's a big question that gets talked about a lot. I think the first, if you can show up with an idea that you see someone as being bigger than they are, right? Hey, I appreciate what you're doing, but I know you can improve even more. Like, that's the idea that that's a compliment is a big idea, right? Some people think that's an insult, but the insult, as you know, I was in this conversation the other day, and it was, anybody ever played any kind of team sport knows this, but the day to worry about is the day that the coach quits yelling at you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because that's the day that he doesn't think, or she doesn't think you can get any better, right? So as soon as a leader establishes that, hey, I'm talking to you, I'm coaching you up, I'm raising my expectations for you, I'm seeing you growing your value contribution because I know you can, right? It's a huge compliment. And once you establish that, you can really influence people to perform differently. And I know you've seen that in your career. And that's part of that toolkit for sure. What people get wrong, to the second part of your question, is they imagine they're going to get there with critique. And that's not the way to get there, right? The science tells us that it's literally 500% more effective to change people's behavior with positive recognition than critique, right? But a lot of us, it's easier to see what's going wrong than it is what's going right. But every leader, as they elevate, they learn that catching people doing things right is actually job one, right? Let's just, even if you have to look really hard at that you're really only going to grow people with recognizing when they do it correctly, right? And you'll have people in their 60s. I know you know some of these people, 70 years old, that never figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty mind-blowing. And I think about that today as a parent is, am I just recognizing when they're doing something wrong? And I don't know where that came from, but it's almost like our nature to we're like, everything's fine, something looks wrong, go solve that.
Well, it's easier to see,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Let's blame the boomers. What do you think?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good blame pillow to have.
I don't know what, I think it's just so visible, especially with kids, everything matters so much, and everything, you have an opinion as a parent about everything they do. And so, but yeah, even with kids, catching them doing it right, honey, that's exactly what I was talking about. That was really well done. Maybe next time even try this other thing, and it translates directly into the workplace. And when you build up a recognition skill set, you can do a lot of things. And what's funny is as you move up in an organization into executive leadership, that can become like your whole job. It's really all you're doing at a certain point. So, yeah.
How frequently do you actually see that done? In the different worlds you go in companies, where people are by nature, and I don't know if that's empathy, I don't know if it's maybe they have more feeling for their environment, but where people are actually doing that, and consistently as well, not just like the Wally and the team come in, they're riding that high of, oh, I just learned something new, I'm going to do this for a week, and then it dies out.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely an expiration of that kind of motivation, right?
Yeah.
I would say I see it sometimes. There's different kinds of leaders that I get to work with. So 3 types really. One, there's the entrepreneurial leaders, there's the hired gun leaders, right? And then there's family business leaders. And those are the 3 types I get to work with. The hired guns all know it because they had to learn it somewhere else or they wouldn't have gotten the job, right? The entrepreneurs never know it. And that's all that stuff about founder syndrome and all that. They're really good at catching people doing things wrong. And because they're founders and started a company just like you, Greg, they know exactly how it's supposed to be. And it's really easy to see anything that's outside of the lines, right? So it gets a lot of their attention. So they need a lot of self-management to pay attention to what's going right. The family leaders can be a little bit better. They're kind of in between those 2 categories because you've got the familial relationships, which keep you from being too heavy, right? So they kind of land in the middle. But entrepreneurs, founders, they have the hardest time because the stakes are so high, right? And they're so plugged in, they know exactly what it's supposed to look like. So it's difficult. And I spend maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how much of my conversations are centered around that exact thing too. 2 other things in there, if I could throw them in, is this thing that as your responsibility and authority goes up, that kind of self-awareness goes down, right? You forget. It's harder. You got a bigger job. You got more people wait. And the biggest variable in the mix is something called position weight. And position weight is, or power dynamics, whatever you want to call it, that as you gain more authority and more, you're bigger boss, right, in your business, whatever your title is, everything you say is multiplied by a lot, right? So you have this thing where you say like a level 3 critique, let's say, or level 3 feedback, and it lands like what? A 9, a 10, it lands with nuclear force, right? Like, we've all had that happen to us. But as bosses and leaders, and especially founders and entrepreneurs, we forget that we can't be highly critical because it just weighs too much, right? Have you ever been blown up by a casual critique from a company? We've all had it happen to us, right? Yeah. So that's it. Is this multiplier of position weight making everything bigger than it is, and we forget about that sometimes as leaders.
Interesting. Yeah, position weight. I think that could be with a mentor. That could be, anything. And you've probably come across this in how people have conversations and how people approach conversations. I think that's a big part of a great leader is, the words they use, the different power words or the words that help you release, potentially the stress of talking to that leader. Have you found anything, and this is kind of like a good news, bad news thing, but where people are able to give constructive, criticism or feedback or, whichever word you want to put to it
Yeah.
in a way that is not going to affect, maybe you're commenting on someone's, collar and, maybe the last shirt they had, they spilled coffee on the collar and it's still like bugging them. And then you're like, hey, your collar looks a little bit off and it just makes them blow up because they're holding it in. How do you confront that to get to, that path forward to help them improve, I guess you could say?
There's some really reliable ways that again, part of that toolkit. One is what you called out there, which is just remember what's happened so far. Like there's always emotional data in the room before you even start the meeting. Like what were the last 3 things you said to her kind of negative, right? Or were they positive? Like if she remembers, do you? Right. So that's part of like remembering the emotional data or just acknowledging that there is a history there. What's happened? Have I made a few deposits before I made the withdrawal? Right. And the other one, the bigger one is contexting. And really good leaders excel at contexting. And if you do it right, you can say almost anything, Greg. Like I could say, hey, I see all the hard work that went into this. I'm so glad I picked you for this project, Greg. I do have a couple pieces of feedback if that's okay with you. Okay, now whatever I say after that, I can say anything, right? Because I contexted, I soften the ground a little bit by acknowledging the work, telling you that I'm glad that you're on it, right? So leaders, really great leaders get so good at that. And they have the same kind of back pocket phrases they use all the time. One I use a lot is, hey, there's a chance I'm going to say this in a super clumsy way, Greg, but I need to say it. And I need you to hear it in a way that'll help you, deliver differently. It has nothing to do with what you've done so far. It has nothing to do with our amazing future together, but I need to share a couple things with you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what I say now, right? Because I did the work. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think sometimes as leaders, you get ramped up to get it out because you've been, as a leader, like you're stewing on something because you're trying to sort through all these different things in your business. And then somebody comes in and you're like, hey, Wally, we need to have a conversation. And then you're like, you just spit it out. And then, it's you don't know how it's going to hit. So it's that atomic bomb that you touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Being dropped.
And back to your first question, this is where quiet leaders or less vocal leaders can have a little bit of a challenge sometimes is you won't have the conversation and then you won't have the conversation and then you won't have and then you finally do. And the pressure's kind of built up a little bit. And then when you do it, it has more emotion in it than it probably should because of the pressure, right? Have you ever had that where you finally have the conversation and it sounds really big and it wouldn't have been had you talked to the person a few weeks ago, right? I'm sure you've had that.
Oh man, many times.
You know that one?
Yeah, many, 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 many times. Yeah, I think as a young leader, that was one of my, biggest pain points was, I was leading people who were twice my age and, they were looking down on me. So I felt like when I had a conversation, I had to bring a sense of seriousness to it, to kind of gain respect before whatever I was going to say. And that made them basically shut off.
Yeah.
But nobody would give me the feedback. And that's one of the biggest things I think for people who enjoy learning and kind of meeting people in the middle is I love feedback. So like I knew somebody cared when they were giving me feedback, whether it was good, bad, or ugly. So I was like, everybody else might want feedback as well. And I didn't know how to deliver it, which definitely hurts the other person. And that hurts you because you're not getting that desired effect.
Yeah, that is so well said. And that's where a sports background like yours really pays off because you learn to really value the quality of your feedback is the quality of your performance in sports, right? Like all the things you learn, don't do it that way, do it this way. And then immediately, like they tell you how to hold the ball or a different way to wind up, you get a different result as soon as you do it. And it's better. Mm-hmm. So you're like, give me more feedback. That's helping me. You're making me a better player. The same thing happens at work, but people aren't trained. They haven't had the reps that you've had in getting and using and leveraging feedback. So it's a little bit tougher. I talk a lot about in coaching the second score, and the second score is a very important idea. And the way it is let's say that, you got a D- or a C- level feedback. You didn't do it very well, Greg. You can still get an A+ on how well you accept that feedback, right? Which is really all the leader wants anyway. The leader already knows what happened. The leader's looking for how you accept that coaching feedback, and anybody can get an A+ on that, right? So I don't like what I'm getting. I don't like that I didn't do a good job, but I can overachieve, right? I can exceed your expectations by how I receive that. I can thank you for it. I can act on it, right? So does that make sense? The second score of how it's received, it's a big deal. And what a lot of people don't know is that's really what the leader's looking for anyway, is how you absorb and leverage, and turn that feedback into action.
Yeah, that's a huge breakthrough, because it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond. And I think that second score, it puts it contextualizes that point that I think a lot of people, want when you bring up, not always positive information, is you want someone to be receptive and then give you some type of response of, I understand that, where you're coming from, and, here's what I plan to do to improve. I mean, when we walk out of a conversation like that, it's like the weight lifted off both of our shoulders.
It's amazing. Yeah, that's magical. Like if you gave me, let's say, a C- level feedback, Wally, I really expected you to do better in the podcast. I thought you had more to share than that. That's a bummer, right? I'm hearing this bad news. And I say, hey, I appreciate the clarity there. I can definitely prepare differently next time. I think you'll see me come up with a different kind of energy next time we do it. Great. Like my stock is going up in that conversation, even while you're giving me negative feedback, right? I mean, 100%. Don't you agree?
Oh, yeah. 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 What did it take to get you there to kind of recognize that aspect? Because I think it's critical personally and professionally.
Well, I get to watch, in my role, I've got a front row seat to watch a lot of executive leaders deliver feedback, and I get to see how people react. And then I watch these executive leaders, the CEOs I work with, watch these people's stock go up and down in their organizations based on, can they accept this? And so I'll actually, over the few years, you'll see whole org charts change based on who can and can't act on feedback. Whole companies change. We know some of these people in common, like they look different because of who can and who can't accept. Because you can't accept feedback, there's your lid. Right? Didn't you see that in baseball?
Yeah. Yeah. When you think or you think you have it figured out, and that's where a year later you're off the team because your skill set didn't adjust,
and worse,
you're miserable. Yeah,
and you don't even know why. Like those guys, then they're telling the story. Yeah, I guess it just wasn't for me, or I didn't. Maybe if I'd had a little bit more help. They're forgetting that along the way, 6 people told them to do it differently, and now they don't play baseball anymore. Or they don't work for the company anymore. Yeah, it's so big. It's I think you're spoiled because of your sports background. You saw feedback given, acted on, right, actualized, added up, where a lot of us go through our whole lives and haven't really seen a lot of that. We don't get a lot of reps. And so even in our 30s and 40s, we're not ready and don't know how to accept feedback.
Yeah, and the school system teaches us, here's the grade, and there's no second score. There's no conversation about, here's what happened on the test. Here's some ways you can do better.
Yeah.
That type of back and forth does not happen. And it needs to be a course.
Yeah, with our parents. Like our parents are really good at that, where they'd say, okay, what are you going to do about this? Right? Like these are not okay in the Tomczyk house. What are we going to do about this? Right? How can we help? Do you need additional resources? Do you need a tutor? How do we fix this thing? And so all these things cross over to parenting too, of course.
Yeah. How do you think we teach the general population, just like people at mass scales, that type of life skill?
Man, what a great question. I get to see it a lot. I'm a little bit spoiled because I get to give a lot of feedback, and I get to see who does and doesn't accept it. And it's definitely a personality trait a little bit, which you can't do much with.
Yeah.
I guess just make sure there's a lot of feedback happening, so it's not so rare that people don't know how to deal with it. That's where 360s and a lot of things we do with annual reviews and all that can be really useful. I'm a big fan of assessments. There's a lot of really good assessments out there. You've heard of some of these DISC and predictive index and Myers-Briggs and all that. It's a good way to accept a feedback, some kind of feedback coming out of a machine. Sometimes people are better with machine delivered feedback because it feels so objective. There's no human feelings behind it. You know what I mean? So that's one way. That's one way to get that box open. But It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. A lot of the really great thought leaders in leadership have tried hard to give us language to talk about how you get good at accepting feedback. Adam Grant talks a lot about it. A lot of Tom Peters used to talk a lot about it. Jim Collins talks a lot about it. It's attached to humility in a way, and it also is who's giving the feedback. So in some organizations, when the boss is so big and important, this hasn't happened in your organization yet, but when you have a couple of layers between you and your frontline people, Greg, which you won't be able to deliver feedback that's negative. It's just too radioactive because of that position weight, right? So then you have to trust the next level down and the next level down. So that's how companies scale around feedback, but it's challenging.
Yeah, it is, especially early on in the company because the stakes are so high. I mean, I've experienced that as a young company, and multiple partners who could accept feedback, couldn't accept it. What do you think? Do you think that personality trait can be changed to? I know you can improve your acceptance of feedback, but if somebody just doesn't want feedback, so they're not even seeking it, but you have to give it to them in order to continue the mission, is it a lost cause, or how do you get through to somebody that doesn't want feedback, and you can't tell them, they don't like feedback, and that because that's feedback to them, I guess you could say.
I think it's the onus is on the deliverer, not the receiver. And so I think the conversation I'm in a lot, the leader just has to be very aware of what the ratio looks like. How many deposits have I made to my withdrawals, right? And just like any other account, when you make too many too many withdrawals, you're going to overdraw on the relationship, right? So it's the same thing. So the onus is on the leader to make enough deposits in the form of recognition and credit and attention, empathy, all those things you said earlier, in order to allow them to make a withdrawal when the time comes. People that won't accept feedback haven't had enough deposits. I really believe that. I don't think it's I don't think there's a type of person. I think there's a type of person that hasn't had enough deposits in their life that makes them hard for them to accept feedback. They've been so critiqued the whole way through. Some of these people didn't get a lot of support from parents and teachers and coaches, all these things. And so a lot of times a progressive leader is the first time they've ever had recognition of themselves and their performance. And so that's how you crack the lid on being able to deliver the kind of critique that'll help them level up. But do you believe that the onus is on the leader more than the receiver?
Yeah, I do. And I like how you contextualize the deposits and the withdrawals, because that's an important distinction. I think sometimes we expect people to take things how we would accept it or would take it on, but that's not always the case. And I think it's that story we're telling ourselves. If we're like, this person is supposed to accept it because I would accept it,
right?
That's a bad story to be telling ourselves. So
that's so true. Like our default is to deliver feedback the way that we want it, and it's the worst, right? Like you're always wrong if your default is how would I like it. You're a business owner. You're built with a whole different kind of stuff, right? I think the onus is on us. We got to make all these deposits. When I have someone that I'm working with saying, I just can't get her to do it differently, or I just don't think he can do it, I always ask about that ratio. Well, tell me about the deposit to withdrawal ratio. Where are we on this? Have we made enough deposits? It's the only way we already talked about the science, right? It's the only way to make people bigger. So a critique is making someone smaller while you're asking them to get bigger. I mean, there's some impossibility there, right? So it lands on the leader to make sure that the proportion is right.
Yeah. And it can be such a fragile relationship, because if you think about, people that may not have seen leaders younger on in their days, in their life, and then they get to their first job. I mean, that first leader or that first couple leaders is so critical for how they look at the world.
Yep.
So it's such a fragile relationship, and it's, like you said, it's got to be a part of the job description almost for a leader to have these, tools that you recognized as, the toolkit for leadership. And it's just, it's one of those things that can make or break somebody's whole perspective on where their career goes from there.
Perfectly said. Yeah. And the stats are out there. Like all these numbers are changing out there in the world to reflect these priorities. The number one reason why people leave today isn't compensation, isn't anything, but the number one reason is that they don't feel appreciated. number one. And number two is a distant number two. So the number one reason talented people with options leave jobs is because they don't feel appreciated. The number one thing people are looking for in their roles are professional development. It's not even money anymore.
Wow.
And if you think about the disparity, Greg, between company A and company B on positive recognition, it can be 1,000%, right? Where the disparity on compensation is what, 10, 15%? So it's wildly different. And companies that aren't going to pay at the top of the market can still compete on culture because they're really good at creating that coaching environment where there's positive feedback and carefully delivered critique, right? And we can play with anybody and compete with anybody in that way. But a lot of companies don't think of it. A lot of leaders don't think of it as being strategic, even though it is.
Do you think a lot of the quitting and the not feeling appreciated and valued, do you think that at its core is that companies are not doing enough when it comes to understanding what that individual links their self-worth to, and kind of asking the right questions? Because I've never been asked by previous employers, hey, what do you value and how can we meet in the middle? Maybe I say, I'll take half the salary if I can get 10 more days off to vacation. Nobody's ever even asked that question.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you said earlier. We use our own defaults, and here people think, most of us think that everybody else is motivated the same way we are. If we're money motivated, we think everybody is. If we're flexibility motivated, we think everybody is. If we're motivated by upward trajectory or the ability to get more responsibility, we think everybody is. And they're not. To your point, some people want completely different things. So yeah, don't you think we're being forced to get better at that?
Yeah.
Leaders. Mm-hmm. We're in a moment where so many leaders have realized, let's say in the last year, that their employees are not motivated at all like they are. So, right? I mean, that's a seismic shift. And we call it, it's the difference. We all know the golden rule, right? So the golden rule is treat others like you'd be treated. It's a great rule. That's why it's gold. But there's a platinum rule. And the platinum rule is treat others the way they'd like to be treated. And it's a game changer, right? Yeah. And so the gold rule worked for a couple hundred years, but it's time to move on and to figure out why people want to be there and what success looks like for them and all those things you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love these sayings that a lot of us don't even question, like, keep calm, carry on, like these kind of terms that we just kind of take into our repertoire and we believe and live it out.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Our employees disagree, right? Yeah. But we can still be motivated that we are and just do the thoughtful work, just exactly the way you were describing, is to figure out what success looks like for somebody else and where do they see themselves in 3 years. And, it doesn't take a lot to figure out what someone wants out of their job, what someone wants out of their relationship with your company. So it's not like it's super complicated. We don't need to make it super complicated either.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that probably starts with establishing rapport, establishing trust from the start, because if you go into somebody that you don't know and, they're just joining the company and you're like, what do you really want, out of this role or out of your life so that we can help you? Most people are like, oh, I just want to, I want to come to work and I want to help you accomplish things. And it doesn't get to the crux of what's going to make that person push through the obstacles.
Yes.
So I think, the platinum rule is, that's a huge one.
Well, imagine a boss, you sit down or you're going to work somewhere else and you say, okay, here's our core values. Here's what we care about around here. I'd love to hear how you see yourself contributing to these, John, as a new employee. Let's talk about it. I'd love to hear your definition of success. And I just want to go ahead and go on the record and say, I'm not always going to do and say what you want me to. I'm a very highly motivated founder of a company. You may hear me raise my voice here and there. I care very much about what goes on here, but it doesn't mean we can't have conversations. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything I say. Like, imagine that person. Like, who doesn't want to work for that person, right? But sometimes it takes us a while to get there. And that, that's what coaching's for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do you think so many people go into leadership with such a hard, I guess, a strong will? And they feel like they have to be that, like, hard rock of, like, this is stability, which is like, the anger and the, telling people what they think they want to hear versus what they need to hear. And, why do you think, is that just like the Roman, leader that people are going after, or is it just programming?
You said it earlier. Where are the examples?
Yeah.
I mean, show me the good examples of bosses. I Is there one on TV? Is there one in the movie? I don't know. I don't know if I've ever seen a good, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just not thinking about it, but there's so many bad examples of manipulative, selfish, right? Hostile. In fact, even the word boss kind of connotes all these really negative things, doesn't it?
Yeah. 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 It's interesting that you bring that up. And you've probably done some research on this or worked through the obstacles with folks as companies get more remote, and kind of, leading from a digital perspective. I mean, how do you replace that in-person connection and the feeling of, energies and, how people's body language is,
It's
over
hard.
the internet?
That's today's conversation, right? Like that's super challenging, and we're very slowly figuring it out. There are ways to engage remotely in ways that bring the people closer to their organization. It's funny. I was reading the research yesterday about this actually, and it's like the answer to do you want to be a remote worker is mostly yes, right? Most of us are saying yes to that. But at the same time, people are, the more remote you are, if you're fully remote, hybrid, whatever, the more remote you are, the less connected you feel to your company's culture and the less you like your job, interestingly. So I'm telling you on one hand, Greg, that I'd like to work remotely, even though over time I'm going to come to dislike my job more. Like I don't even know what's best for me. You know what I mean? And so that it's really, that is not resolved, and we'll have to figure out, I'm sure there's technical tools. We just got ahead of this. All the futurists said that we were all going to be in this remote mode by 2028, 2027, 2028 is what they all say. Of course, the pandemic fast forwarded all this. We weren't ready for it. Culturally, we weren't ready for it, right? So all the technology shows up. We're like, hold it. What do we do now? Is this what work looks like now? No one's really sorted it out. So you need to fix that, Greg. Get on it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the recommendations we started to make to companies that we work with is less plugged in time. And we realized like the desire to come in the next day or the desire to bring yourself to a project as opposed to being on your email, 14, 15 hours a day, reducing that a couple hours made them more excited to do the work or the project. And it's not cybersecurity, but it's really, a huge mindset shift companies need because we use technology kind of in a trance almost. Like we're just like, it's here, it's a part of us. But we never question if there are downsides, like you mentioned, which is
well, and that's all. Yeah, exactly. And this idea of all these, push notifications coming at us all the time, and not making decisions about what comes into our attention or what comes into our consciousness during the day. So all that stuff's going to get. I think is one answer to your question. Is we're going to get better at managing that, where we see these things on a schedule. Right. I look at my emails every 45 minutes. I don't look at them in real time, because our attention is being subdivided in a way that's hurting productivity, right? I always think of it like it's a war between everybody and Palo Alto or wherever all the people are that are inventing these things. We're losing this war, and it's not close. Do you agree?
Absolutely, yeah.
So our attention's being divided and subdivided, and we're not very good at managing that yet. So there'll be a bunch of coaching around that and a lot of best practices that are starting to show up, just like the one you just said. But can I ask you a question about your business?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious about, and I see this in healthcare and other industries too, where people don't make the decision to solve a problem until after some kind of incident, right? Like the joke is, I'm going to get serious about my health and diet after the stroke. And it happens in your business too, right? It almost takes a cybersecurity incident to get very serious about cybersecurity, right? So what are you doing about that? How can you help us take it seriously before there's some kind of threat showing up?
Yeah, I almost think about it, and you've mentioned this before, like, do you wait till after the health crisis to get healthy? I think for a lot of people, they have to see signs of it being a potential thing to happen, whether it happens to them or happens to somebody they know.
Okay.
We always compare it to, if you spend a little bit now, you're going to avoid that triple cost of what's going to come later. And I always relate it to health, just because that's what I know from baseball and sports is, if you wait until the season's over to improve and you're not improving in practice, each and every day, you're probably not going to be in the winner's side, by the championship season of that year. So it's those small activities And I think a lot of folks are so confused when it comes to cybersecurity, they don't even take those small steps. So that's been a huge one that we talk a lot about in keynotes and speeches that we give is here are the activities. We'll give you the step-by-step plan, but if you're not willing to periodically practice and visit it, you're not going to get anywhere, and you're probably going to be a part of that statistic that has the health crisis or has the cyber attack or has the your company blows up from a leadership standpoint. I think it's muscle memory, it's practice. I think that's where a lot of people are missing out right now, and that's why I like to bring kind of a coaching aspect to cybersecurity, because I think people need cybersecurity coaches or technology coaches,
Yeah.
especially when they're running companies that are so connected and doing so much business from a digital perspective. They're just kind of shooting from the hip. They're not doing it consciously, and most of them want to be conscious in how they lead their business.
Yeah, I like the idea of coaching there. I think, yeah, it would help. Like, who's not a technology company now? Find me a company that's not a technology company. You install fences, you're still a technology. You know what I mean? Like that idea that we're all that, because I think people used to put your business and the need for it in a certain sector, but it doesn't belong there. And what you said earlier was also true. Like, as soon as someone near you gets it, you take it seriously. And I've seen that happen again and again, like in a group, someone, and then of course everybody's making the phone call and getting hooked up. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you have to feel it. And it's just like with leadership, you have to almost feel that conversation of, I was able to make those deposits before I dropped this versus just getting right into the withdrawal.
Right.
And until you feel the difference in the outcome of that situation, you kind of only know one way. I think that's I think at the crux of what we've talked a lot about today, which is that consciousness, getting better each day and having people around you who are helping you improve. And that's where leaders support leaders and build up other people to become leaders. And that's what we need more of.
No doubt. No, well said.
What are some other tools in the toolkit that we may not have hit on that you're seeing as critical for folks who are either aspire to be leaders or are already leaders that are continually improving?
I'll say two more things. I think whatever you can do to increase your self-awareness, right? Like, self-awareness is one of these things that gets more challenging as you move up, like we talked about, and specifically fluency around unconscious biases. And we're all starting to get exposed to some conversation about unconscious biases, but they just drive so many business outcomes. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Unconscious bias, of course, means a bias that's at work in your life or in your work that you're unaware of, that's influencing things. A classic one is affinity bias, which shows up as a gut feeling about someone. I interviewed 3 people, and I had such a good gut feeling about that middle guy, Mark. He just seems like the kind of guy that would be a great culture fit here. That's all bias, 100%. That's why we hire the person that went to our college or was in our fraternity or who plays golf like we do, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's insane. And there's so much risk in it. And a lot of really highly placed leaders still make most of their big decisions that way. The other one is status quo bias, which is an irrational preference for how things are, even though how things are may be the riskiest proposition. And I see it every day. I'll see it again today, I'm sure 2 or 3 times, where the choice that's being made is the riskiest possible choice. But because it's the way we've been doing things, all the inertia is there, right? And so it's so hard. I guess that's why they're unconscious biases, right? You can't see it. So some kind of fluency around that. The other one is recency bias, like results that have happened most recently carry the most weight, even though they may not be the most important data. So there's so much there. I'm trying to get better at that myself. That's a study for me. But status quo bias may be the biggest risk in business today. And it almost needs to flip. Like, anything that you've done the same way for a certain period of time, Greg, is risky. If this is our process, we've been doing it this way for 5 years. Well, crap, blow that up. 5 years? What process can survive 5 years? Are you kidding me? And yet there's the inertia, right? Pushing it along, creating risk. So does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's something I think about, but sometimes can't contextualize it. Those unconscious biases, and how do we, without feedback from the outside world, we're just listening to our own thoughts. Well, one of the things I've been studying a lot, and I'm going to have some guests on is how the nervous system impacts some of the decisions we make. And how it just impacts how we go about, living our daily lives, business, personal side as well.
I'll look forward to that one.
Yeah.
The weird thing about that, the unconscious bias thing, is it happens. Smart people have it worse than everybody else. Like almost the smarter you are, the more confidence you have in these biases, which is crazy dangerous, right? So it's almost like the disease of really smart people. You know what I mean? So it's nuts. But good. When you have those guests on, I'll tune in for sure. I've got a lot to learn on that.
Yeah, I think that's like a whole nother book, is unconscious biases. And so for the status quo bias, so that is, I know everybody says like we've always done it this way, so that's the way we're going to do it. How do you think you find the balance of questioning your status quo without being the person who, one day has one goal, then they throw that goal out and they're going for another goal and they get exhausted
Yeah.
by trying to change things quickly.
Leadership ADD.
Yeah.
My favorite question on it is and I'll ask you the takeover CEO question, and that is, if somebody else came in with a ton of cybersecurity experience, who had run a successful company, maybe even exited or sold a successful company, came in and took over your business, what would they change right away? What would they change immediately? Because they're not subject to any status quo bias, right? They're ready to blow it up, right? So, and people always have an answer to that question. Every leader goes, I know exactly what they would do. They would fire this guy. They would change this thing. They would raise prices. They would fire this set of clients. They would move, whatever. But there's always almost an immediate answer to that, which penetrates status quo bias. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's complex, because you only do what you know is true in what you've done up to that point. But the only way to improve is to kind of know you don't know it, and ask the right questions to the people around you. And I think that's the hardest thing to do as a leader, because it makes you maybe look weak or look like you're not, the right person for the job sometimes, because you don't know that certain point or how to change it.
Yeah, but it's obviously that kind of progressive vulnerability. Like, hey, I think this is the right way forward, but let's explore. Let's see. And the way you said it there was great. Like, I'm doing the best I can, but is it the best?
Yeah.
I don't know. Let's find out. Right. Like that's where all the good stuff comes from. Right. Is that gap between your best and the best. Right.
Yeah. I think that's one of the, now that we talk about it, that's one of the traits in like great coaches versus good coaches, was they kind of recognize like, this is a new season. We may have done things this type of way, but this is a new season with new opponents. We need to kind of redefine, how we operate as a team, what type of routines we do, all that good stuff. And that's what helped us. You kind of reset your biases, and then you create, obviously create new ones as you go into the season, but that's critical.
Yep, no doubt. And that's why it's sometimes easier to do that as a losing team, right? Where everybody knows that these don't work. The winning team has trouble breaking the status quo bias, right? Because even though the stakes have changed and the pieces on the board are different now, it's hard to make those changes.
Yeah, it is. What do you think about connecting with personnel, connecting with other leaders in your company? For folks listening in, if they're in a remote environment and there's not the ability to get together, what are you recommending folks do to keep the connection going that you need to operate, something that's going against the grain, either a company or, some type of project you're working on? What can people do to connect when they feel so unconnected, but they're, connected by the internet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sort of in the discovery phase there. I've seen some things work. There's some best practices for sure. There's a bunch of companies now that have like a zone during the day that's the no meeting zone that works across all the time zones they might exist in. If it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, like a 1 hour, and that is time for non-meeting conversation. If you want to connect with someone, there are some people that are doing hybrid work things where they have like all in Wednesday, just a day, right? That we all get in there as best we can, or 1 day in that's just for certain departments. Like we have the marketing in on Monday. We're going to have ops in on Tuesday, the coders are in on Wednesday, whatever it is. There's a couple companies like that operating in Assembly where we both work, and it works. Anything social, I mean, it's funny because all this stuff seems so nerdy, and some of it's even cringy, but happy hours, alcohol-free happy hours with the team, breakfast. I've been part of a waffles breakfast that was completely virtual. We had a breakfast together with everybody cooked their own waffles and showed up.
Wow.
But I think we're going to get a lot more clever about that. That's a work in progress. I bet what do you think? 10% to where we're going to be on how that's going to work?
I don't really see companies doing anything. They're kind of like, it's easier to not do something that might seem corny to some people. And it's like, those are the things people most of the time enjoy. They're like, that's kind of corny, but I like it because
that's exactly right. And I always say, if people are rolling their eyes, they're still there.
Right.
It's almost like that's the goal. If I can be so nerdy that I can get half my team to roll their eyes, I've done something right as a leader, right? Like, there he goes again. Fantastic, right? Like, that's great.
Yeah. You help them improve as well. And that's at the crux of leadership. And it's helping get people out of their comfort zone, which that's where people most of the time will grow the most.
Yeah.
When they're outside their comfort zone. Yeah.
It's courageous. Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, a lot to unpack here. We're going to have some good snippets that we'll come out with on some of the great things you've been able to share with us today. One of the questions we like to end the show with, which is at the crux of why we do this show each week, is around connection. Wally, in your life today, what does connection mean, personal or business?
I would narrow it down to, for me, everything is about influence, right? Like we've talked about. And so for me, connection means that I'm influencing some outcomes in my community and that I'm being influenced by these outcomes in my community. Like I'm attached both ways. I'm a force for good, right? And then I'm also benefiting from the great work that other people are doing. That's how I get a feel of connection. There's a physical connection, but it's mostly this sort of invisible momentum in a community or an industry that I like being a part of. And it makes me feel really good and connected. And I work mostly remote. I don't have a real day-to-day office except here at home. So it's important, and I'm a big believer in it.
I love that. I'm going to drop in the chat here, the Leader Lab, Leadership is a Verb, new book. Where can folks find that? Is it across all avenues?
It's on the leaderlab.com website and on Amazon. But yeah, brand new ebook. Okay. We made it very inexpensive. And get it. It's the first fully graphic leadership book. And it's 150 pages, graphic images. Some of you have seen some of this stuff on LinkedIn. But it's a very easy read. It reads like a leadership comic book, but it'll make an impression, I promise.
I love the graphic, because a lot of people are pulled into graphics, and sometimes words on paper, don't really pull folks in. So I like what you guys are doing there.
Sometimes or every time, right? Like, give me some pictures.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's great. Great resource for folks to check out. Leadership is a Verb. What Exceptional Leaders Know, bestseller. Would you recommend folks check that out? Have you guys done anything lately? I know you came out with a new edition.
Yeah, we had the second edition. What Exceptional Leaders Know was our second book, and was the #1 bestseller, as you said, which was awesome. The new book, Tanya, is called Leadership is a Verb, and you can find it on our website, or you can find it on Amazon.
Definitely put that in the chat. Wally, always a pleasure to connect. Thanks so much for sharing with us, and look forward to having you back on the show in the future.
That'll be fun. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and I'll see you around, Greg.